In the middle decades of the 21st century, humanity stood upon the precipice of boundless promise and looming destruction. A civilization gilded by the sheen of atomic progress, yet corroded by its own ambition. The years after the Second World War had seen an unshakable faith in technology take root across the world, with the United States leading a new global age powered by atomic energy, where every home was promised the security of clean, endless power and the conveniences of robotics and automation. By the 2050 seconds, this atomic dream had hardened into dogma. The transistor had never been developed in this divergent timeline, leaving the world clinging to vacuum tubes and fission power for everything from toasters to tanks. In the glowing blue light of atomic optimism, the nation built its myth, a future of chrome and circuits, nuclear cars, and domestic servitude by robots, all under the watchful eye of a government that spoke in the language of patriotism, prosperity, and fear. Yet beneath the promise of abundance lay a gnawing hunger that would undo it all. As resources dwindled and populations grew, the great powers of the planet began to fracture, their peace upheld only by the unspoken threat of mutual annihilation. In 2052, the illusion shattered when the world was plunged into the resource wars, a global scramble for the last oil wells, uranium mines, and farmlands. Riots spread across Europe as fuel shortages crippled economies. The European Commonwealth collapsed under the weight of scarcity and internal strife. The Middle East burned with endless conflict as oil fields were seized, bombed, and poisoned. In America, the government turned inward, seeking solutions not in diplomacy, but in dominance. They annexed Canada in 2076 under the pretense of mutual protection. Quelling dissent with power armor and propaganda, the United States transformed from a republic into a military state, driven by paranoia and nationalism, feeding its people the comfort of consumerism while rationing truth like a state secret. Vault-Tec Corporation, one of many private arms of this militarized economy, rose to prominence with its promise of safety beneath the soil. The Vault program, publicly presented as a humanitarian effort to protect citizens in the event of nuclear war, was in reality a grand social experiment sanctioned by the Enclave, the secret continuation of the pre-war US government. Each Vault was designed to test a different variable of human behavior under isolation, some with skewed gender ratios, others with unstable leadership structures, still others exposed to experimental drugs, psychological manipulations, or genetic testing. Vault 13, built in the mountains of Southern California, was one of the control vaults, a true shelter intended to remain sealed for 200 years to observe natural social evolution without interference. It was one of the rare facilities not overtly corrupted by Vault-Tec's hidden agenda, though even it would not escape the cruel irony of fate. By 2060, oil had all but run out, the Alaskan pipeline was dry, and American dependence on nuclear energy reached totality. To defend its last frontier of resources, the US launched a campaign of military buildup along the northern coast, converting Anchorage into a fortress and field testing the most advanced power armor and energy weapons ever conceived. Robco Industries provided the automation backbone of the war machine. Mr. Handy Units repaired vehicles and factories, while the RoboBrain, a grim blend of machine precision and human neurology, pushed ethical boundaries to the breaking point. General Atomics International and West-Tech Laboratories became the twin pillars of American science, one manufacturing robotic infrastructure for civilian life, the other pioneering bioweaponry and genetic research for military supremacy. It was West-Tec, working under contract with the U.S. Army, that began the Forced Evolutionary Virus Project, FEV, a mutagenic compound derived from the pan-immunity virion experiments designed to create soldiers immune to biological and chemical warfare. The experiments were conducted at secret facilities, including the Mariposa military base, where scientists and soldiers toiled under orders to forge the next step in human evolution. What began as science soon became heresy. Exposure to FEV caused massive physical mutation, enhanced strength, and severe neurological transformation. When the bombs finally fell, the virus would ensure that humanity's extinction was not total, for something new would rise from the irradiated ashes. But in those final years before the Great War, few outside the military-industrial complex knew what horrors were being birthed beneath their feet. Life on the surface retained its illusion of normalcy. Children played in suburban streets patrolled by protectrons, families drove nuclear-powered sedans under billboards, advertising Nuka-Cola and giddy-up Buttercup horses, and television broadcasts reassured citizens that the American dream was stronger than ever. The Ministry of Morale and the Office of Public Records carefully curated information to maintain the myth of prosperity. News of food riots, blackouts, and insurgencies abroad were minimized or erased entirely. Citizens were told to duck and cover, and to trust in the vaults. Schools taught loyalty, factories demanded overtime, and consumer goods became both currency and religion. It was an age of abundance for those who ignored the cracks in the mirror. But the end was already written in the language of hubris. By 2075, tensions between the United States and China reached their breaking point. China, crippled by its own fuel crises, invaded Alaska to seize its oil reserves. The Anchorage front line became a frozen graveyard of men and machines, where American troops, equipped with T-45 power armor, pushed the Chinese back at tremendous cost. The invention of the T-51 series soon after secured final victory for the U.S., culminating in the liberation of Anchorage. Yet victory brought no peace. The deployment of atomic weapons was no longer an unthinkable last resort, but an inevitability waiting for the smallest miscalculation. The world's superpowers, each armed to the teeth, stood locked in a fatal standoff. Inside the halls of government, the enclave prepared contingency plans, Project Safehouse to preserve select citizens underground, and Project Reclamation to rebuild the nation afterward under their control. Vault-Tec expanded its construction of shelters nationwide, each designed for 1,000 occupants, though fewer than half were ever completed. Corporate monopolies merged with government authority in a seamless union of profit and policy, and dissent became treason. The last vestiges of democracy were extinguished under martial law disguised as patriotism. Those who protested the annexation of Canada or the confiscation of private assets were labeled traitors and disappeared into forced labor camps. The world outside America fared no better. Europe's collapse gave rise to nuclear exchanges over dwindling resources, while Asia descended into totalitarianism and famine. In the shadows of global collapse, Vault-Tec's public service announcements promised safety for those who planned ahead, and families lined up to buy their places in the underground utopia, unaware that most would never see a vault door close behind them. Then, on the morning of the 23rd of October 2077, the nightmare that had haunted the world for 3 decades became reality. Sirens screamed across every major city as radar screens lit up with dozens, perhaps hundreds, of nuclear launches. Who fired first remains lost to history. Some say it was China. Others claim an automated US defense system triggered by mistake, or even deliberate initiation by elements of the Enclave seeking to reset the world. What is certain is that within 2 hours, civilization ended. The great cities of the world, Washington, Moscow, Beijing, London, became incandescent suns, their outlines erased in atomic fire. The atmosphere itself convulsed as shockwaves raced across continents. Those few who reached vaults before impact were entombed beneath earth and concrete, listening to the distant thunder of humanity's last breath. Above ground, millions died instantly. Millions more perished in the weeks that followed as nuclear winter descended, blotting out the sun beneath a veil of ash and dust. Radioactive fallout swept across oceans and mountains, poisoning the land, the water, and the survivors who lingered in the ruins. In a matter of hours, the achievements of 10,000 years of civilization were reduced to cinders. Governments ceased to exist. Communications fell silent. The old world ended not with a whimper, but with a blinding flash that seared its memory into the bones of the earth. And yet, amid the death of nations, life clung stubbornly to existence. The vaults sealed shut, their occupants unaware of what awaited them when the doors finally opened. Robots, programmed to serve, continued their endless routines in empty homes. In the wasteland that would one day be called California, radiation and mutation reshaped the very fabric of life. Animals twisted into new species: the rad scorpion, the Brahmin, the molar rat. Humans who had been trapped in irradiated cities like Bakersfield became ghouls, walking relics of the pre-war world. Their flesh decayed, but their minds often intact, cursed with immortality and the memory of everything they had lost. Farther north, at Mariposa, soldiers who had survived the initial blast would soon find themselves transformed by the leaked FEV virus, their minds fractured, their bodies remade into monstrous strength. These were the seeds of the post-nuclear age. For 2 centuries the world would slumber in ruin, the remnants of humanity struggling in isolation beneath the earth, or scavenging the bones of the old world above. Vault 13, buried deep within a mountain, would remain sealed according to its design, its inhabitants living generation after generation in sterile safety, their history of the surface reduced to legend. The overseer's duty was to protect them, to preserve the continuity of human civilization until the world became habitable again. But time erodes all plans, machines fail, systems degrade, and fate does not honor blueprints. In the end, even in its attempt to control survival, humanity had only delayed the inevitable confrontation with its own creation. The Great War was both an ending and a cruel beginning, the end of the world that was, and the genesis of the world that would become Fallout. In the silence that followed the bombs, a new history began, not of nations and ideologies, but of survival, mutation, and the long, slow rebirth of civilization from the ashes of its own destruction. When the firestorms faded and the skies turned black, the world was left in a silence that no living memory could comprehend, a silence not of peace, but of annihilation. The Great War of 2077 had lasted less than 2 hours, yet in its wake stretched centuries of ruin, the sun veiled by soot and the air heavy with death. Those who survived did so by accident or by design, huddled in the crypts of Vault-Tec's concrete sanctuaries, in military bunkers built without hope, or in basements that miraculously escaped collapse. Outside, radiation became the new weather. drifting in invisible waves that warped the land and the flesh of everything that remained. Entire ecosystems collapsed. Forests withered into skeletal plains, oceans boiled and receded, and animals that had once grazed or flown freely mutated into grotesque new forms. The first survivors to emerge from the wreckage were changed as well. Some burned beyond recognition, others slowly transformed by exposure to radiation into the ghoulified remnants of humankind. These ghouls, their skin blackened and peeling, their bodies preserved in a state of necrotic stasis, were both cursed and blessed. They could live for centuries, immune to further radiation, but forever marked as the ghosts of a world that no longer existed. In the ruins of Bakersfield, the first of these communities formed, eventually known as Necropolis, where ghouls sought shelter in the husks of underground sewers, building a fragile society beneath the bones of the old one. Elsewhere, scavengers picked through irradiated cities, gathering pre-war technology, food rations, and ammunition, often dying from invisible poisons before they could enjoy their spoils. The post-nuclear decades blurred together in cycles of famine, violence, and mutation. But beneath the ground, in secret facilities like Mariposa military base, the legacy of pre-war science endured, undisturbed and deadly. Mariposa had been one of the crown jewels of the US military before the war, a fortress of research and secrecy tasked with advancing Project FEV, the forced evolutionary virus. The soldiers stationed there were loyal, disciplined, and ignorant of the full scope of their mission. When the bombs fell, they sealed the base, believing themselves the last custodians of the nation. Vault-Tec, the company that had designed FEV, was obliterated by nuclear fire when a Chinese strike annihilated its primary laboratory in Southern California, but Mariposa remained intact, its researchers continuing their work under military oversight. Weeks turned to months, and paranoia began to rot the ranks. In the face of global extinction, the soldiers demanded answers, questioning why they were experimenting on test subjects when the world above was dead. They discovered the truth. The virus was no mere defensive measure. It was intended to rewrite humanity itself, to create a new species immune to disease, radiation, and chemical attack. Betrayed and horrified, Captain Roger Maxson, commanding officer of the Mariposa detachment, confronted the lead scientists, who justified their experiments as necessary for the survival of the species. When Maxson saw the state of the human test subjects, bodies bloated, limbs stretched, and minds gone feral, he executed the entire research team in an act of mutinous justice. The soldiers swore loyalty not to a dead government but to each other, sealing the base and declaring themselves a new order dedicated to preserving the remnants of human knowledge. Their exodus across the wastes toward Lost Hills would, years later, give rise to the Brotherhood of Steel. But before that order could form, another horror gestated in Mariposa's laboratories. When Maxson's men left, the facility remained contaminated, its sealed vats of FEV leaking into the environment. Decades later, scavengers, wanderers, and forgotten survivors stumbled into the ruins of Mariposa, succumbing to the virus's mutagenic embrace. One of them was a man named Richard Gray, a former medical officer and scientist from the hub, who would unwittingly alter the course of post-nuclear history. Gray had accompanied a caravan expedition to Mariposa in search of pre-war technology after hearing rumors of military caches buried beneath the base. The group's curiosity became its doom. They were ambushed by mutant creatures, once human remnants of soldiers twisted by the FEV. Gray fell into a vat of the substance during the chaos, where he should have died instantly. Instead, he changed. Over weeks of agony, his body dissolved and reformed, his consciousness expanding as his cells multiplied uncontrollably. The virus consumed him, but it also awakened in him an intelligence beyond human comprehension. Richard Gray ceased to exist. In his place rose the being who would call himself the Master. His body became a shifting mass of flesh, nerve, and machine. His mind a chorus of absorbed identities. Linked to the base's computers, he devoured information as he once devoured tissue, merging logic and madness into one. From this twisted genesis would come the Unity, the Master's vision of a world reborn, where all humanity would be remade in the image of his perfection, united as one through the FEV. Yet while this transformation brewed in darkness, the surface world was changing in smaller, more fragile ways. Communities began to form amid the ruins, the first sparks of post-war civilization. Scavengers gathered in caravans, establishing trade routes between scattered settlements. In the ruins of Los Angeles, survivors rebuilt shantytowns from scrap metal and concrete, only to be buried again when aftershocks and radiation storms rendered the area uninhabitable. Farther north, groups of settlers and nomads found refuge in the remnants of military depots and pre-war towns, their lives dictated by the twin forces of scarcity and violence. Out of this chaos rose figures of legend and infamy. The raiders who preyed upon the weak, the traders who risked their lives to move goods through irradiated deserts, and the would-be warlords who dreamed of building empires from the ashes. The hub, once a water trading outpost, emerged as the first major settlement of the new age. Its economy built upon the distribution of purified water and pre-war goods scavenged from Vault-Tec ruins. By the 22nd century, it had grown into a thriving city-state, a crossroads where merchants, mercenaries, and dreamers converged. Its influence spread across the wastes, linking Shady Sands, Junktown, and Necropolis in a fragile web of commerce and conflict. But for every settlement that rose, countless others felt a famine, disease, or raider attacks. Life in the wasteland was a daily negotiation with death. Radiation storms could sweep across the plains without warning, stripping skin from bone. Mutated creatures prowled the ruins, deathclaws, nightkin, and other remnants of human experimentation. Yet amid all this, humanity endured, stubborn as the cockroach, and twice as adaptable. They dug wells, built walls, and passed down stories of the old world, like half-remembered myths. The children of the post-nuclear age grew up never having seen blue skies, yet they dreamed of rebuilding what their ancestors had destroyed. Some worshipped the atom as divine retribution, others saw in it the promise of a new beginning. From the ashes of religion and science emerged cults, technocracies, and warbands, each claiming to hold the key to humanity's salvation or dominion. In this fractured world, the Master's influence began to seep outward, subtle and unseen. From his throne of machinery beneath the ruins of the Los Angeles boneyard, he extended his will through a growing army of supermutants, once human captives transformed by FEV into towering, sterile soldiers. They believed themselves to be the future of humanity, immune to disease and radiation, stronger and more disciplined than their creators. The Master preached unity, declaring that the chaos of the wasteland was the result of humanity's divisions, and that only through forced evolution could peace be achieved. His followers, the children of the cathedral, spread his message of salvation, disguising their true purpose behind a facade of faith and charity. To the average wastelander, they were healers and missionaries, To the initiated, they were the vanguard of a new species destined to inherit the Earth. Meanwhile, the Brotherhood of Steel, now entrenched at Lost Hills, pursued their own vision of preservation. Where the Master sought to remake humanity through mutation, the Brotherhood sought to control its technology, hoarding pre-war relics and weaponry to prevent another apocalypse. Between these opposing ideologies, mutation and preservation, the fragile rebirth of civilization was caught in an invisible tug-of-war. The wasteland had become a laboratory of evolution, its experiments written not in theory, but in blood. And while the surface world struggled to redefine itself, the sealed communities of the vaults remained oblivious, their inhabitants clinging to the belief that the world outside was still uninhabitable. Generations lived and died beneath fluorescent lights, their reality a simulation of the past, their history reduced to filtered data approved by overseers. In Vault 13, deep beneath a mountain, systems still hummed, water recyclers still worked, and the great steel door had not moved in over a century. Its people were safe, for now. But even safety has a half-life. Machines corrode, and human needs always outlast design. In time, even the most perfect system begins to fail, and when it does, the cycle of the wasteland, of death, mutation, and rebirth, reaches out to claim what it is owed. The post-nuclear world was no longer a place of nations and borders, but of scattered tribes, experiments, and the long shadow of human arrogance. From the ashes of the Great War, mutation had not merely survived, it had become the new order of nature, the inheritor of all that was lost. And in the heart of California, the stage was set for the story that would define the wasteland. A story born in darkness, sealed behind a vault door, and destined to step once more into the light. When the radioactive storms began to fade and the air grew thin enough to breathe again, the ruins of the world revealed a new and terrible beauty. The years after the Great War had reshaped the Earth beyond recognition, turning once fertile plains into deserts of glass and bone, and cities into skeletal monuments half buried under ash. From the scattered survivors of humanity, a new order began to take shape, not through planning or design, but through the raw, instinctive will to live. In Southern California, where the pre-war infrastructure had been both dense and vital, remnants of highways and industrial complexes provided the foundation upon which the first settlements of the wasteland would rise. Centuries after the bombs fell, these survivors no longer thought of themselves as descendants of an old civilization. They were the first of a new one, forging meaning amid ruins older than their memories. The wasteland was a mosaic of contradictions, ruin and renewal, savagery and cooperation. Raiders stalked the roads that once connected cities, preying upon travelers and merchants, while isolated groups of settlers gathered around sources of clean water and arable soil, building towns out of scavenged steel and concrete. Of all these settlements, 4 would come to define the early rebirth of post-war California: the Hub, Junktown, Shady Sands, and Necropolis. Each told a different story of survival, and together they formed the spine of the wasteland's new civilization. The Hub, the first and largest, began as a water trading outpost established by merchants who had discovered a functioning water purification plant beneath the ruins of an old pre-war structure. Its founder, a man known as Loxley, saw in this rediscovered technology the opportunity to create stability through commerce. As caravans formed to distribute purified water across the wasteland, the Hub became the nexus of trade, drawing in scavengers, mercenaries, and settlers from every direction. Over time, it evolved into a thriving city-state, governed by guilds, each representing different economic interests. From the water merchants to the Fargo traders, law in the hub was a matter of negotiation and influence, with power balanced between wealth and force. Corruption and ambition were as common as clean water, but beneath the greed, there existed a genuine belief that trade could rebuild civilization. Southwest of the hub lay Junktown, a smaller and rougher settlement built in the ruins of a pre-war truck stop. Where the hub was ruled by commerce, Junktown was ruled by personality. Its founder, Killian Darkwater, had once been a trader himself, before turning sheriff and mayor, imposing law through grit and revolver. He believed in rebuilding community through order, standing against raiders and criminals who threatened to drag humanity back into chaos. His greatest rival, Gizmo, represented the other half of Junktown's soul, a crime lord who ran gambling dens and rackets, arguing that vice was as much a part of human nature as virtue. Their uneasy coexistence reflected the moral tension that defined life in the post-nuclear world, whether order could prevail without corruption, or if survival required compromise with darkness. To the north of Junktown and east of the hub lay Shady Sands, the most humble of the great early settlements. Founded by Aradesh and his daughter Tandy, Shady Sands began as a single collection of tents and adobe buildings clustered around an irrigation canal. Unlike the hub, it had no pre-war infrastructure to rely upon, only the labor and will of its people. Aradesh preached cooperation, education, and unity, teaching that the mistakes of the old world should never be repeated. Over time, Shady Sands became a beacon of hope, its fields of Brahmin-fed crops sustaining neighboring settlements. It was here, under the shadow of old ruins, that the idea of rebuilding a nation would first take root, though in these early days, such dreams were still far away. Far beneath the scorched surface, in what had once been Bakersfield, Necropolis endured in a darker reflection of Shady Sands. Its inhabitants were not human, but ghoul, survivors of Vault-12, whose door had deliberately malfunctioned upon closure. Exposure to radiation had preserved them in a state of undeath, leaving their minds largely intact, but their bodies grotesquely withered. Led by Set, a cunning and bitter ghoul with ambitions beyond mere survival, Necropolis became a refuge for outcasts and a warning to all others. To the living, it was a cursed city. To the ghouls, it was proof that life, in any form, could endure. The relationship between Necropolis and the surface dwellers was one of fear and necessity, for even the ghouls needed water, and the hub's merchants were willing to trade for their scavenged pre-war technology, so long as they could stomach the stench. These cities, scattered and imperfect, represented the rebirth of civilization. Between them ran the arteries of the wasteland, dusty caravan routes, patrolled by guards in leather armor and wielding rusted firearms. Bandits and mutated beasts made travel perilous, but trade persisted, for without it, no settlement could survive. Through this tenuous network of commerce, ideas began to spread. Stories of vaults, of technology buried beneath the earth, of strange creatures and forgotten machines. Legends of the Brotherhood of Steel circulated in hushed tones, tales of men in shining armor who hoarded weapons of the past. To some, they were saviors, to others, they were tyrants. Few had seen them and lived to tell the tale. At Lost Hills, deep within their underground bunker, the Brotherhood grew in strength and knowledge, training scribes to preserve data and knights to recover technology from the wastes. They viewed the surface world as reckless and unworthy of the tools that had once destroyed it, believing themselves the last stewards of true civilization. Yet even their isolation could not shield them from the chaos spreading across California. Raider gangs, emboldened by desperation, terrorized settlements, their leaders rising and falling in an endless cycle of brutality. The Khans, one of the most feared of these groups, descended from survivors who had embraced savagery as a creed, raiding caravans and enslaving captives. Though their power waxed and waned, they left scars on every community they touched. In the wastes, power was measured not in ideals but in firepower and food. Those who could not defend what they had lost it. As generations passed, the wasteland hardened its children. The old world's knowledge decayed into rumor. Holodiscs became relics worshipped more than read. To a farmer in Shady Sands, the word America meant nothing, and the concept of nations seemed absurd. The wasteland was their world, bounded only by the horizon and the reach of their weapons. Yet beneath the brutality, there was an unspoken resilience. Humanity had been reduced to fragments, but those fragments began to fit together again, crude and incomplete, but functional. Merchants organized routes, farmers rediscovered irrigation, even raiders, in their own way, imposed a brutal kind of order. Out of chaos came rhythm, and out of rhythm, the first faint whisper of civilization reborn. But the wasteland was not at peace. Something else stirred in the dark corners of the land. Rumors of a growing army of super mutants, marching from the north, capturing towns, and disappearing into the night. No one knew where they came from or what they wanted. Their sheer strength and discipline set them apart from raiders. They fought with purpose, as if following a design greater than themselves. Caravans vanished, entire outposts were erased, and refugees spoke of monstrous figures demanding surrender in the name of a new unity. In the hub, merchants debated the truth of these stories. In Shady Sands, Aradesh feared they heralded a new war. In Necropolis, the ghouls saw them as a sign that even mutation could evolve further still. The wasteland was changing again, the fragile order of its settlements trembling under the weight of an approaching storm. And far below, in Vault 13, the great door remained closed, its inhabitants blissfully unaware of the world that awaited them. Their isolation had preserved them from the wasteland's horrors, but it had also sealed them off from its evolution. Their time would come, and when it did, the balance of the wasteland would shift forever. For now, the surface world waited, scarred, reborn, and restless beneath a sky that still remembered fire. The story of Vault 13 is not merely the story of walls of concrete and steel, but the story of humanity's fragile hope, preserved beneath a mountain for decades, a sanctuary where generations grew up in the illusion of safety, while the world above rotted under radiation and chaos. Built as part of Vault-Tec's nationwide program, Vault 13 was designed to be a control vault, one of the few that would remain sealed for a full 2 centuries, without outside interference, a laboratory for observing how a community would evolve when entirely isolated. The inhabitants were carefully selected, their lives regulated by overseers who were as much scientists as leaders, measuring behavior, maintaining systems, and ensuring that no contamination from the surface could infiltrate their perfect subterranean microcosm. For generations, the people of Vault 13 believed the outside world was uninhabitable, a dead land of fire and radiation, and their society coalesced around the rhythms of daily life: rationed meals, water recycling, scheduled work, and educational programs designed to instill order and obedience. Their legends of the surface were drawn from filtered stories and fabricated reports, creating a mythology of a wasteland inhabited only by danger and death. In truth, the world above had begun to recover in its own violent, imperfect way, yet the vault's inhabitants remained ignorant, shielded from the consequences of human resilience and mutation. But perfection has its limits, and even Vault-Tec's meticulous design could not anticipate the slow erosion of mechanical systems and human error. The heart of the vault's survival, the water chip, began to fail decades before the door was scheduled to open. A critical oversight with potentially fatal consequences. As the chip began to degrade, the overseer faced a decision that would shape the destiny of the vault and, unknowingly, of the world beyond. The failure was irreversible. Without intervention, the vault would face the death of its population. In accordance with pre-war emergency protocol, the overseer convened a council to select a candidate for the mission, an individual capable of leaving the vault to recover a replacement chip from the wasteland, a journey unprecedented and fraught with danger. The selection was both pragmatic and symbolic. It was not merely a matter of skill, but of temperament, intelligence, and the ability to navigate the unknown without succumbing to the moral compromises that the outside world demanded. Thus, the Vault Dweller was chosen, a single figure destined to carry the weight of generations on his shoulders, to step into a world of ruin, mutation, and emergent civilization where every encounter could mean life or death, and every choice carried consequences that would ripple far beyond his own survival. As he left the vault, the enormity of the task became apparent. The wasteland stretched out like a canvas of ash and rust, dotted with ruins of cities, irradiated rivers, and the skeletal remains of machines built for a world that no longer existed. The first steps of the Vault Dweller were both literal and symbolic. He left the safety of human-engineered order and entered a realm governed by chance, mutation, and the raw instincts of survival. Early encounters were instructive and brutal. Raiders preyed upon travelers and caravans, teaching lessons in caution, combat, and the value of negotiation. Creatures twisted by radiation, rad scorpions, molorats, and feral ghouls, served as both obstacle and teacher, shaping the Vault Dweller's understanding of the new natural order. Settlements like Junktown and the Hub offered fragments of human society, revealing that civilization, however fragile, was beginning to reassert itself. Trade, governance, and moral codes existed, but they were fragmented, inconsistent, and vulnerable. The journey to recover the water chip was more than a task. It was an initiation into the ethics and politics of post-nuclear life. The Vault Dweller confronted moral dilemmas daily, whether choosing to assist one settlement over another, confronting raiders, or deciding the fate of ghouls who, while sentient, were feared and often reviled. Every decision carried weight, for in a world where law was often enforced by the strong and morality was a matter of perspective, the actions of a single individual could tip the balance between survival and annihilation. In this environment, the Vault Dweller learned the first lesson of the wasteland. Survival alone is insufficient. Influence, diplomacy, and the courage to act decisively were required to shape the world. However modestly, the Vault Dweller's path also brought the first glimmers of understanding regarding the greater threats lurking beyond the ruins, whispers of mutated armies, of strange cults, and of an intelligence seeking to impose its vision upon all life. The scale of the threat was difficult to comprehend, even as the Vault Dweller navigated it, yet the first confrontation with the consequences of human hubris, the remnants of the FEV experiments, irradiated zones, and mutant-infested ruins, foreshadowed the larger, existential dangers to come. Through encounters with technology, both old and misappropriated, the Vault Dweller began to piece together the truth of the pre-war world, that mankind's own ambition had created both the tools of its destruction and the experiments that would haunt the survivors for generations. The journey highlighted a paradox of post-war existence: the need to respect and preserve technology for survival, while understanding that technology had been the instrument of near-total annihilation. Thus, Vault-13, intended as a haven, became the catalyst for the resurgence of humanity's agency. By sending forth a single individual into the wastes, the Vault unwittingly initiated the chain of events that would define Southern California for decades. The first contact with organized settlements, the rediscovery of pre-war knowledge, and the confrontation with the mutants and ideologies that would threaten or shape civilization. In this crucible, the Vault Dweller was forged not only as a survivor, but as a symbol, the first link between the old world and the emerging future, carrying forward both the memory of humanity's failures and the hope for its renewal. Vault-13 had opened, not merely in door, but in consequence, setting the stage for the struggles, alliances, and revelations that would define the wasteland's first tentative steps toward rebirth, and in doing so, it became the hinge upon which the story of the first Fallout game, and the new civilization it chronicled, would turn. Upon leaving the secure confines of Vault-13, the Vault Dweller stepped into a world that bore the scars of civilization's hubris, a vast expanse of irradiated deserts, crumbling cities, and skeletal remnants of pre-war technology, a land simultaneously barren and alive, where the sun seared the earth, and the winds carried ash and sand over highways that had long since fractured into jagged paths. And yet, in this desolation, life endured in forms both familiar and grotesque. Mutated creatures scuttled through the ruins, their bodies reshaped by radiation into rad scorpions, with pincers capable of crushing bone, molar rats with jagged teeth and cavernous maws, and feral ghouls, whose decayed flesh belied minds still tethered to memory and experience, living echoes of humanity's folly. All of them reminders that survival in this new world required vigilance, resourcefulness, and a keen understanding of the environment, for the wasteland punished carelessness with swift, sometimes lethal consequences, and the Vault Dweller quickly learned that every step, every choice, carried weight. As he navigated through the shattered landscapes in search of the vital water chip, the device that would determine the fate of his entire vault, a mission that demanded travel across regions both treacherous and uncharted, where each encounter with scavengers, traders, and hostile factions tested not only his combat skills but his ability to negotiate, reason, and make moral judgments under conditions of extreme duress. And in these early days, he encountered the first hints of the complex web of post-war society, discovering that human communities, though scattered and fragile, had begun to reassemble along lines of commerce, protection, and necessity, that settlements like Junktown, born from the ruins of an old truck stop, had established rudimentary governance under a self-proclaimed sheriff who maintained order through a combination of charisma, intimidation, and the pragmatic enforcement of laws designed to maintain survival in a lawless land, and that other settlements, such as the Hub, functioned as the nexus of trade, connecting water merchants, scavengers, and itinerant traders in networks that stretched across the wastes, providing not only resources but information, rumor, and the fragile scaffolding of civilization in miniature, all of which the Vault Dweller observed with both curiosity and wariness, for the social order he had known in Vault-13 was tightly controlled, sanitized, and insulated from the moral ambiguity of the real world, whereas here, choices had consequences visible in blood, starvation, or the collapse of alliances, and he learned to navigate these dilemmas with careful attention to loyalty, reputation, and the shifting balance of power between groups who could, in an instant, go from allies to enemies depending on circumstance or necessity. And as he moved further across the desert, the environmental challenges became as formidable as the human ones, for radiation zones, irradiated water sources, and mutated flora demanded caution, and the Vault Dweller had to rely on both scavenged technology and instinct to avoid contamination or injury, repairing pre-war equipment, fashioning rudimentary armor, and learning to ration supplies across long stretches where nothing grew and nothing lived, except for the twisted forms of life that had adapted to survive in a land where the old rules no longer applied. And in this crucible, he developed not only the skills necessary for survival, but a deeper understanding of the wasteland's history and the lingering consequences of the pre-war world, discovering through abandoned military bunkers, ruined laboratories, and scattered data logs that the same forces which had created the vaults, the FEV experiments, and the nuclear arsenal had also left a legacy of mutation, technological risk, and fragmented knowledge that would shape humanity's recovery for generations. And, amidst all this, the Vault Dweller began to piece together the moral complexity of the world he had entered, recognizing that raiders, slavers, and mutated humans were not merely villains, but the products of circumstance, scarcity, and survival, while settlers, traders, and vigilantes were equally flawed, bound by fear, loyalty, or desperation to choices that mirrored his own. And as he traversed deserts dotted with the skeletal remains of towns whose foundations were now overrun by rad scorpions, mutated Brahmin herds, and the creeping tendrils of radiation, he encountered other travelers who shared stories of the pre-war world, whispered rumors of the Brotherhood of Steel hoarding technology in the north, and tales of the Master and the emerging threat of supermutants, hints of a larger conflict that stretched beyond his immediate mission and threatened the fragile equilibrium of the wasteland. Yet even in the midst of hardship, he found signs of human ingenuity and resilience. Water purification plants operated by hardy engineers, makeshift farms irrigated by old pipelines, and rudimentary trading posts, where bartering, negotiation, and diplomacy allowed life to persist against staggering odds. And in this vast desert of ash and ruin, the Vault Dweller came to understand that his journey was not simply a task of survival or retrieval, but a formative odyssey that would shape the destiny of his people, forcing him to reconcile the innocence of the Vault with the brutal pragmatism of the wasteland, to understand that survival required both action and conscience, and that the choices he made along the way, whether to assist a settlement in distress, punish a raider band, or spare a ghoul, would ripple outward, influencing the web of emerging societies, alliances, and power structures that defined the post-nuclear world. And through the long days of relentless sun, treacherous terrain, and constant threat of death from both beast and human, the Vault Dweller became more than a representative of Vault 13. He became a bridge between the old world and the new, a living testament to the adaptability of humanity, a figure whose courage, intelligence, and moral discernment would define not only the success of his mission, but the early formation of society in the wasteland, ultimately setting the stage for the encounters, discoveries, and confrontations that would lead to the emergence of the new California Republic, the rise of the Brotherhood of Steel as a technological guardian, and the inevitable confrontation with the Master and his unity, all while teaching the Vault Dweller that the desert, in its endless expanse of ruin and mutation, was not merely a place of survival, but a crucible of morality, politics, and human resilience, and that stepping into it was to step into the living, breathing, ever-evolving story of the post-war world, where every path chosen, every ally made, and every foe confronted would shape the history of the wasteland for generations to come. The hub, situated at the crossroads of the irradiated wasteland, represented more than a mere settlement. It was the first manifestation of commerce, culture, and fragile governance emerging from the ashes of nuclear devastation, a beacon for scavengers, traders, and wanderers seeking stability amid chaos, where the remnants of pre-war infrastructure, pipes, water treatment facilities, and ruined factories were repurposed into the skeleton of a functioning society, its markets bustling with Brahmin-drawn caravans, scavenged goods, and purified water essential for survival. And it was here that the Vault Dweller first observed the intricacies of human interaction in a world where law was sparse and morality relative, for the hub relied on a complex balance of authority, negotiation, and mutual dependence, enforced not only by the leaders who claimed legitimacy through charisma and pragmatism, but also by the tangible power of those willing to wield force when persuasion failed, and through encounters with merchants, artisans, and guards. The Vault Dweller began to appreciate how trade shaped the landscape, providing not merely sustenance, but a means of social cohesion, creating networks of obligation and alliance that extended across the desert to other settlements, such as Shady Sands and Junktown. And in this environment, he learned lessons essential for understanding post-nuclear human society, that survival was as much a matter of diplomacy as it was of combat, that wealth and reputation were as powerful as weapons, and that knowledge of pre-war technology, however decayed, provided leverage in a world where every tool, every functioning pump, and every operational weapon carried significance. While observing the hub's governance, he witnessed how disputes were resolved through a mixture of negotiation, force, and custom, seeing that even in a society emerging from devastation, human ambition and greed persisted alongside altruism and necessity. And these early interactions revealed that the future of the wasteland would be determined by those who could master both persuasion and power. The hub's existence depended not solely on survival skills, but on the careful maintenance of social contracts, and the Vault Dweller's presence brought both assistance and risk, for the introduction of new knowledge, pre-war technology, and combat skill could tip the balance in favor of one faction over another, potentially destabilizing delicate trade relations. And as he engaged in tasks ranging from water purification, resource transport, and combat missions against raiders, he understood that his influence extended beyond immediate survival, shaping the economic, political, and ethical foundations of an entire region, while also encountering the moral complexities inherent in interactions with various groups, from the hub's leaders seeking stability, to itinerant traders balancing profit against risk, to desperate scavengers willing to steal or kill for scarce resources. And the Vault Dweller had to weigh each decision carefully, for one misstep could reverberate across settlements, altering alliances, provoking retaliatory raids, or changing perceptions of authority. And through these experiences, he also learned the importance of information and intelligence, for the hub functioned not only as a trading center, but as a hub of knowledge, where rumors, pre-war data, and stories of the wasteland circulated freely, enabling him to plan routes, avoid hazards, and anticipate threats, while simultaneously gaining insight into the broader post-war landscape, including the existence of the Brotherhood of Steel in the north, the encroaching menace of supermutants, and the persistence of other vaults whose histories intersected with the fate of Vault 13. And as the Vault Dweller navigated these dynamics, he saw the human capacity for adaptation, for cooperation under duress, and for the creation of order from chaos, learning that the rebirth of society in the wasteland depended on networks of trust, trade, and mutual defense, that leadership required vision tempered by pragmatism, and that the moral choices he made would echo across the desert, influencing not only immediate outcomes but the long-term trajectory of civilization. And so the hub stood not merely as a waypoint or a source of supplies, but as the embodiment of humanity's resilience, the heart of trade that allowed survivors to endure, connect, and organize. And it was within this framework of commerce, conflict, and cooperation that the Vault Dweller honed his skills, tested his ethics, and learned the lessons necessary to confront larger challenges, ultimately demonstrating that the future of the wasteland would be shaped by those who could combine courage, intelligence, and moral judgment with an understanding of the complex social and economic systems emerging from the ashes of a world destroyed by its own hand. Emerging from the wreckage of pre-war America, the Brotherhood of Steel represented both a continuity of military order and a radical reinterpretation of purpose, in a world unmoored from its former moral and political frameworks. A society born from the remnants of Mariposa military base, where Captain Roger Maxon's revolt against the FEV experiments had crystallized into a doctrine of technological stewardship, a rigid philosophy asserting that the knowledge and tools that had brought humanity to the brink of annihilation must never be misused again. And yet the Brotherhood's isolationism, its hoarding of pre-war artifacts, and its strict hierarchy placed it in constant tension with the scattered human settlements, striving to survive and rebuild in the irradiated wastes. For, to outsiders, the Brotherhood could appear simultaneously as savior, tyrant, and mystery. Their power derived from the synthesis of martial discipline, pre-war technology, and an uncompromising belief in the sanctity of machines as the ultimate safeguard of human civilization, and from the very beginning, their doctrine was clear. Knowledge without restraint is as dangerous as the bombs that ended the world. And those who could wield technology must be the guardians, not the inheritors, of its power, a principle codified in the early rituals of Lost Hills where the first initiates were trained, the scribes charged with cataloging, studying, and preserving relics of the old world, and the knights tasked with recovering dangerous technologies from the ruins of California, often facing threats that no ordinary wastelander could survive. From irradiated zones to the mutated horrors that stalked the deserts. And in this environment, the Vault Dwellers' encounter with the Brotherhood was not merely an exchange of information, but a profound confrontation with the ethical and philosophical implications of technological control. For while the Brotherhood sought to prevent history from repeating itself, their methods, secrecy, hoarding, and unilateral enforcement sometimes placed them in opposition to the human drive to rebuild, trade, and expand settlements like the Hub and Shady Sands, and this tension underscored the complex dynamics of post-war survival, revealing that even groups with ostensibly noble intentions could become obstacles to growth when ideology eclipsed practicality. And yet, within the Brotherhood's ranks, there was discipline, skill, and an unparalleled understanding of pre-war machinery. from laser weapons and power armor to preserved databases of scientific knowledge, a treasure trove of human achievement that, in the wrong hands, could have replicated the catastrophes of 2077, but, in their stewardship, became a stabilizing force, a bulwark against chaos, and for the Vault Dweller, the encounter illuminated the duality of humanity's inheritance. Power is inseparable from responsibility, and the wasteland would only endure if those who possessed it understood both the potential and the danger embedded in every piece of salvage technology. Yet even as he learned from the scribes and trained with the knights, the Vault Dweller also saw that the Brotherhood's priorities sometimes clashed with the needs of ordinary survivors. Their refusal to share technology or intervene in local conflicts, a stark reminder that ideals could be as isolating as the vaults themselves, and that the reconstruction of society would require more than guardianship. It would demand collaboration, negotiation, and moral flexibility, qualities the Brotherhood often lacked, but which the Vault Dweller needed in abundance to complete his mission and navigate the complex political and social landscape of the wasteland. The philosophy of the Brotherhood was inseparable from their history. Rooted in the decisive action of Maxon and his soldiers, who had acted against both the military hierarchy and the scientists of Mariposa to prevent the further spread of FEV, an act of both courage and rebellion that established a precedent for the autonomy of the organization, creating a culture that revered individual initiative but subordinated personal ambition to the collective mission. And this duality permeated their operations, from the recruitment of new scribes who were drilled in the ethical handling of technology, to the deployment of knights who retrieved weapons caches, often confronting mutated creatures and hostile factions with an almost ritualized precision. The Brotherhood becoming simultaneously a military, a religious order, and a repository of knowledge, with ceremonies that honored the past, while reinforcing the mandate of control over tools that could both preserve and destroy. And in this context, the Vault Dweller's interactions became a test not only of skill, but of ethical alignment, as he had to balance his survival, the interests of his vault, and the broader needs of the wasteland against the rigid worldview of the Brotherhood, whose devotion to technology sometimes blinded them to the immediate realities of human suffering, scarcity, and the moral compromises required in a world where law was fragile and death was omnipresent, and the presence of the Vault Dweller within Lost Hills, seeking assistance, advice, or even cooperation, forced the Brotherhood to reckon with the outside world in a direct way they had avoided for decades, revealing that isolation, while safe, could not shield even the most disciplined order from the ripple effects of a connected and unpredictable wasteland. And as the Vault Dweller learned from the scribes, he saw both the brilliance and the peril of their approach. Pre-war machines could be repurposed to heal, defend, and stabilize, but without careful guidance, the same knowledge could replicate the cataclysms that had destroyed the world. And in this realization lay the philosophical heart of the Brotherhood, an organization that existed to safeguard not only technology, but, in theory, humanity itself, though the definition of protection was often inseparable from control and dominance. And through conversations, training, and shared missions, the Vault Dweller absorbed the nuances of this worldview, understanding that the wasteland required a careful balance between preservation and action, between secrecy and engagement, and that his decisions, like those of the Brotherhood, would have far-reaching consequences, shaping the survival and growth of settlements, the outcome of conflicts, and ultimately the trajectory of human civilization emerging from the shadow of nuclear fire. And while he departed Lost Hills with knowledge, tools, and allies, he also carried an understanding that the Brotherhood's worldview, though founded on wisdom, discipline, and foresight, was not absolute, that morality, survival, and the preservation of life required flexibility as well as doctrine, and that the wasteland, in its complexity, demanded both vision and adaptability, a lesson that would inform every subsequent encounter with the super mutants, the Master's unity, and the fragile communities striving to reclaim a world nearly lost to its own hubris, reinforcing that the first step in rebuilding civilization was not merely survival, but the negotiation of values, power, and responsibility. Principles embodied in the Brotherhood of Steel, a society simultaneously of men and machines, guardians and judges, whose presence illuminated both the promise and peril of humanity's post-apocalyptic journey, and whose philosophy would echo across the wasteland, influencing the Vault Dweller, the scattered settlements, and the very future of the world beyond the Vault doors. As the Vault Dweller traversed the scarred expanses of Southern California, evidence began to emerge that the wasteland's dangers were no longer random or isolated, that amidst the scattered human settlements, raider gangs, and mutated creatures, there existed a more insidious and organized threat, whose reach extended beyond the immediate horizon, whispered in fear and rumor as the presence of supermutants, monstrous beings created decades earlier in the secretive Mariposa military base experiments, their very existence a testament to humanity's reckless pursuit of power and the unintended consequences of tampering with life at its most fundamental level. And as these rumors solidified into encounters with marauding patrols of hulking, green-skinned warriors, the Vault Dweller began to comprehend the scale and ambition of what he faced, that these were not isolated aberrations, but the beginnings of a structured movement, guided by a central intelligence, later revealed to be the Master, a being whose conception had been forged in the intersection of human ingenuity, mutation, and a distorted vision of evolution, whose intellect, charisma, and command over the FEV mutated army threatened to impose an unnatural order on the wasteland. And yet the Master was not merely a warlord, but a philosopher of his own perverse design, seeking to unify humanity and mutant kind into a single, homogenized entity, believing that only through enforced transformation could the chaos, fragility, and moral weakness of humanity be corrected. And in this context, the supermutants were both soldiers and emissaries, carrying out the Master's vision across the desert, while simultaneously embodying the horrors of unchecked scientific hubris, erasing settlements, capturing inhabitants, and coercing entire communities into compliance, leaving survivors to speak of raids, disappearances, and strange religious fervor centered around the enigmatic cathedral. And through these encounters, the Vault Dweller recognized that the wasteland's post-nuclear dangers were evolving from environmental, social, and mutant threats into a cohesive ideological force, one that required not only tactical skill, but moral clarity and strategic thinking. For the Master's ambitions challenged the very notion of human agency and survival, forcing the question of whether preserving humanity meant protecting its flawed nature or allowing it to be subsumed into a new order designed in the image of his vision. And as he gathered intelligence from traders, caravans, and refugees fleeing destroyed settlements, patterns began to emerge, pointing toward the cathedral as the epicenter of the super-mutant operations, a place of worship, indoctrination, and scientific manipulation, where the Master consolidated control and nurtured the unity, an army and ideology intertwined, its outwardly spiritual veneer masking the monstrous transformation and ruthless enforcement of conformity, and in every story collected, the Vault Dweller discerned not only the scale of the threat, but the insidious manner in which the Master's influence spread, corrupting minds, bending loyalties, and blurring the lines between victim and participant. For those who fell under the Unity's sway, did so through persuasion, coercion, or fear, their humanity diluted by the FEV virus while their bodies were strengthened and weaponized to serve the greater design, and these observations solidified the Vault Dweller's understanding that the challenge ahead was not merely physical, but philosophical, that defeating the Master would require comprehension of his ideology, the logistics of his army, and the weaknesses inherent in the very system he had built, which combined science, fanaticism, and charisma to create an empire both terrifying and fragile, and this knowledge was tempered by the grim realities of travel across the irradiated wastes, where each encounter with raiders, mutated wildlife, and hostile terrain demanded vigilance, resourcefulness, and an ongoing negotiation between immediate survival and long-term objectives, highlighting that the wasteland's complexity was matched only by the strategic acumen of the Master, whose presence cast a shadow over every settlement, caravan route, and survivor community, forcing the Vault Dweller to reconcile the moral weight of his own actions, whether to aid one settlement at the potential expense of another, how to confront supermutant patrols with minimal casualties, and how to integrate intelligence gathered from disparate sources into a coherent strategy capable of confronting an enemy that combined overwhelming physical power, ideological fervor, and technological knowledge. And as he continued his journey, the scale of the Master's vision became increasingly apparent. He was not content with mere conquest or destruction, but sought to reshape life itself, fusing human and mutant into a unified organism that would, in his mind, transcend the mistakes of the old world, eliminate disease, and impose a single vision of order upon the chaos of the post-nuclear environment. Yet in this same ideology lay vulnerability, for the Master's vision was predicated on the assumption that transformation equated to loyalty, and that intellectual and moral diversity were weaknesses rather than strengths, a flaw the Vault Dweller would ultimately exploit in his mission to dismantle the Unity. And in the interludes between battles, reconnaissance, and tactical planning, he also observed the human dimension of the Master's influence. Families torn apart, communities enslaved or eradicated, and individuals forced to reconcile loyalty to life, survival, and kin with indoctrination, into a cause that rejected the very humanity they sought to preserve. And through these observations, the Vault Dweller came to understand the full horror and complexity of the Master's shadow, a force that was simultaneously ideological, physical, and social, whose tendrils reached into every corner of the Southern California wasteland, creating a landscape in which choices were never simple. Morality was situational, and every action carried consequences far beyond the immediate, shaping not only the present, but the future trajectory of civilization in the wake of nuclear apocalypse. And as he pieced together the networks of supermutant activity, traced the flow of information and captives to the cathedral, and weighed the ethical and strategic dimensions of his mission, the Vault Dweller's journey became more than a mission to recover a water chip or confront marauders. It became a confrontation with the very essence of what it meant to be human in a world scarred by human ambition, nuclear fire, and mutation, revealing that the wasteland's ultimate threats were neither mindless nor random, but organized, intelligent, and ideologically driven, casting a long and chilling shadow that demanded not only courage and skill, but foresight, insight, and an unyielding commitment to the fragile preservation of choice, freedom, and life itself against a force determined to redefine both. And it was within this context, understanding the scope, structure, and philosophy of the Master and his supermutant army, that the Vault Dweller prepared for the inevitable confrontation at the cathedral, recognizing that the shadow he faced was as much about ideology as it was about raw power, a complex, multi-layered threat whose defeat would not merely require physical confrontation, but also moral clarity, strategy, and an understanding of human and mutant nature alike, ensuring that the struggle ahead was both epic and profoundly consequential, setting the stage for the Vault Dweller's infiltration of the cathedral, the unraveling of the Unity, and the ultimate moral and existential reckoning that would determine the fate of the wasteland and the survival of humanity itself. The cathedral, an imposing structure of repurposed pre-war materials and grotesque architecture, stood as both the physical and symbolic center of the Master's growing influence, a place where ideology, science, and authoritarian control converged to form the core of the Unity, and for the Vault Dweller, approaching it was not simply a matter of travel, but a confrontation with the very nerve center of the wasteland's most organized and existentially dangerous threat, for within its walls, the Master's vision had taken tangible form, a hierarchy in which supermutants, indoctrinated humans, and mutated abominations served a single purpose: the assimilation of all life into the Unity, a collective designed to erase individuality, dissent, and resistance in favor of a homogenized organism that would, in the Master's mind, correct the failures of the old world. And yet, this grand design was wrapped in layers of religious and spiritual veneer, as the children of the cathedral, devout acolytes of the Master, cloaked his scientific and military operations in the language of prophecy, ritual, and salvation, convincing many that their participation was divine and necessary, blending fear, hope, and manipulation to maintain obedience. And as the Vault Dweller infiltrated this environment, he witnessed firsthand the complex interplay of ideology, coercion, and genuine devotion, noting that the Unity's cohesion relied not only on physical transformation via FEV, but also on the psychological control of belief, tradition, and ritual, an understanding that would be critical to navigating, subverting, and ultimately dismantling the Master's empire. For the cathedral's inner workings revealed an organization that was simultaneously bureaucratic, militaristic, and religious, with meticulously maintained records, surveillance networks, and guard structures ensuring that dissent was identified and quashed swiftly. Yet beneath this rigid structure, the cracks of overreach and ideological inflexibility were evident. For the Master's insistence on uniformity, the suppression of individuality, and the prioritization of his vision over practical governance created vulnerabilities that could be exploited by a cunning and morally determined adversary, and the Vault Dweller's path through the cathedral demanded not only stealth and combat proficiency, but also critical analysis of these structural and philosophical weaknesses, as he observed the interactions between humans coerced into service, supermutants indoctrinated for obedience, and the Master's most trusted lieutenants, discerning patterns of loyalty, fear, and manipulation. And in doing so, he recognized that defeating the Unity would require more than force. It would require strategy, understanding, and moral judgment, for indiscriminate violence could strengthen the cohesion of those who remained, while carefully targeted disruption, subversion, and the liberation of key individuals could fracture the system from within, creating opportunities to undermine the master's influence at its source. And, in these observations, the Vault Dweller also saw the human dimension of the conflict. Victims who had been transformed or coerced, families torn apart, and communities assimilated into the master's vision, all of which underscored the ethical stakes of his mission, revealing that each decision carried consequences that could amplify or mitigate suffering across the wasteland. And as he navigated corridors filled with indoctrinated acolytes, laboratories housing horrific experiments, and chambers where the FEV virus was propagated and administered, he gained an intimate understanding of the technical, social, and philosophical mechanisms that enabled the master to maintain control, recognizing that the interplay of science, ideology, and power was what made the unity formidable, yet also what rendered it susceptible to disruption by a well-informed, resourceful, and morally resolute adversary. And through encounters with resistant humans, captured knowledge, and the careful observation of the master's leadership style, the Vault Dweller developed both the intelligence and the tactical insight necessary to confront the master directly, to exploit the vulnerabilities in his network, and to prepare for the ultimate confrontation that would determine the fate of the wasteland. For the cathedral was not merely a stronghold, it was the epicenter of the master's vision, and the Vault Dweller's understanding of its internal dynamics, ideological structures, and operational methods would define his ability to dismantle the unity, rescue those enslaved within its hierarchy, and preserve the remnants of human society that had managed to endure the nuclear apocalypse. And in this crucible of ideology, mutation, and human endurance, he came to understand that the struggle against the master was both physical and moral. A confrontation not only with brute force and intellect, but with the ethical imperatives of freedom, individuality, and the right of humanity to survive without subjugation to a single, monolithic vision, reinforcing the narrative that the wasteland's survival depended on the judicious combination of knowledge, courage, and moral clarity, and that the Vault Dweller, by infiltrating the cathedral, had become the instrument through which the future of civilization would be contested, embodying the delicate balance between survival, ethics, and the capacity to challenge a system that, while coherent and formidable, was ultimately dependent on the obedience of those who had been subjugated, and whose undoing would demonstrate that even the most monolithic ideologies are vulnerable to courage, insight, and decisive action rooted in both morality and pragmatism, setting the stage for the climactic confrontation that would come to define the fate of Southern California and the moral legacy of humanity in the aftermath of nuclear devastation. The climactic confrontation with the Master represented the culmination of the Vault Dweller's journey, a collision not only of physical strength and tactical skill, but of ideology, morality, and the very definition of what it meant to be human in a world scarred by nuclear devastation. For the Master was more than a powerful mutant or military strategist. He was the embodiment of a philosophy that sought to unify humanity and mutant kind under a single, homogenized organism, a vision that justified horrific acts in the name of evolution and survival. And as the Vault Dweller penetrated the heart of the cathedral, navigating its labyrinthine corridors, indoctrinated followers, and technological defenses, he was confronted with the tangible consequences of unchecked ambition, scientific hubris, and the radical application of ideology. For every room, laboratory, and command center within the cathedral told a story of transformation, coercion, and manipulation, demonstrating how the Master had combined his knowledge of the FEV virus, pre-war technology, and the psychology of obedience to construct an empire that threatened the fragile remnants of human society across Southern California. And in approaching this epicenter, the Vault Dweller was forced to confront not only the Master's physical power, but the moral calculus embedded in his vision, weighing the imperative to protect human life against the practical need to eliminate a threat whose continued existence promised further devastation, mutation, and the obliteration of free will. And this confrontation was preceded by strategic navigation through the Unity's defenses, the careful observation of patrol patterns, the selective engagement of hostile forces, and the liberation or avoidance of humans ensnared within the Master's ideology, all of which underscored that victory required more than brute force. It required intelligence, ethical discernment, and the capacity to understand and exploit the inherent weaknesses of an enemy whose strength lay as much in belief as in biology. And as the Vault Dweller reached the inner sanctum, he witnessed the Master's full form, a grotesque fusion of human, mutant, and machine, a literal and symbolic representation of his philosophy, whose presence radiated both intellect and malevolence, and the ensuing confrontation tested every skill, decision, and moral judgment accumulated over the course of his journey through the wasteland, from the early lessons in Junktown and the Hub, to the understanding of the Brotherhood's philosophy and the careful observation of the cathedral's hierarchy. For the Vault Dweller had learned that survival in this world required not only combat ability, but the discernment to choose when to fight, when to deceive, and when to act decisively to prevent catastrophic consequences. And in the encounter itself, the Vault Dweller utilized a combination of tactical acumen, acquired weaponry, and insight into the Master's psychological vulnerabilities, recognizing that the Master's vision, while vast and powerful, depended upon the continued obedience and cohesion of his forces, and that by striking at the core of his philosophy and the technological means by which he enforced transformation, it was possible to dismantle the Unity without unnecessary slaughter, a delicate balance of action and restraint that mirrored the broader themes of post-apocalyptic survival, morality, and the use of knowledge responsibly. And as the confrontation reached its apex, the Vault Dweller enacted the final decisive measure, exploiting the Master's reliance on his own machinery and biological networks to neutralize him, an act that was both an end and a beginning. For, in defeating the Master, he not only eradicated the immediate threat posed by the Unity, but also preserved the potential for humanity to reclaim autonomy, rebuild communities, and reassert moral and social agency in a world teetering between annihilation and reconstruction. And yet, even in victory, the weight of consequence was palpable. For the Vault Dweller recognized that the destruction of the Master, while necessary, also symbolized the fragility of the post-war world, the tenuous nature of human civilization, and the perpetual balance between power and responsibility. And in the aftermath, as he surveyed the remnants of the cathedral, the liberated humans, and the scattered but resilient forces that had been coerced into service, the lessons of his journey were crystallized. Survival required courage, intelligence, adaptability, and an unwavering commitment to ethical judgment. For the wasteland demanded not only physical endurance, but the capacity to navigate moral ambiguity, weigh competing interests, and act decisively in the face of existential threats. And the fall of the Master, therefore, became both a tactical victory and a philosophical milestone, signaling that humanity could survive and reclaim agency, but only through careful, principled action, the application of knowledge, and the willingness to confront the consequences of both past hubris and present decisions, a lesson that would echo throughout the nascent settlements of Southern California, influencing the future rise of organized communities like Shady Sands, shaping the ethical frameworks of emerging societies, and marking a turning point in the post-nuclear history of the wasteland, as the Vault Dwellers' victory over the Master ensured that the shadow of absolute control, ideological extremism, and unchecked mutation would be removed from the equation, leaving the possibility of reconstruction, freedom, and the preservation of human diversity intact. And in this sense, the confrontation was more than a battle. It was a defining moment in the moral and existential trajectory of the wasteland, illustrating that even in a world shaped by catastrophe, informed action, courage, and ethical clarity could prevail against the most seemingly insurmountable threats, setting the stage for the Vault Dwellers' return, the continued rebuilding of civilization, and the shaping of a future where human agency, ingenuity, and resilience could once again flourish beyond the shadow of nuclear apocalypse. After the Master's defeat and the dismantling of the Unity, the Vault Dweller embarked on the journey back to Vault 13, carrying not only the water chip that had precipitated his departure months earlier, but also the burden of choices, knowledge, and experiences that had transformed him from a sheltered inhabitant of a controlled environment into a figure whose actions had irrevocably shaped the wasteland. And yet, the return was far from triumphant, for upon re-entering the vault, he was met with suspicion, misunderstanding, and the rigid adherence to protocol that had defined Vault 13's governance. As the overseer, conditioned by years of isolation and authority, failed to recognize that the lessons, perspectives, and practical necessities learned in the wasteland were incompatible with the rigid structures and assumptions that had governed life behind the vault doors, and this clash underscored the profound tension between insular authority and experiential knowledge, revealing that survival and morality outside the vault demanded flexibility, ethical discernment, and decisiveness, qualities the overseer was unwilling, or unable, to acknowledge. And in this context, the Vault Dweller's return became a study in the limits of institutional authority, for he had acquired first-hand understanding of human nature, mutant threats, technological hazards, and social dynamics across a post-apocalyptic California, yet these hard-won insights were dismissed or feared, illustrating that even in the wake of monumental achievements, societal structures can resist adaptation, change, and the integration of new knowledge, and as a result, the Vault Dweller faced a profound moral and existential challenge, for he had succeeded in safeguarding his people and the broader world beyond the vault, yet was now confronted with the realization that his own community could not reconcile the implications of his actions with its pre-existing norms, a predicament that highlighted the inherent tension between duty, autonomy, and the expectations of authority. And through this confrontation, the tragic dimensions of his journey crystallized for the very people he had risked his life to protect, whose survival depended upon the successful recovery of the water chip and the neutralization of the Master, now rejected his counsel, misinterpreted his motives, and sought to maintain the comfort of established procedures over the recognition of lived reality, underscoring that heroism in a fractured world is often unrecognized, that virtue and sacrifice do not guarantee acceptance, and that isolation can persist even after monumental external success, and this rejection was compounded by the practical impossibility of reconciling Vault-13's insular worldview with the transformed, complex, and morally ambiguous landscape of the wasteland. For the overseer's adherence to tradition, fear of deviation from protocol, and refusal to acknowledge the wisdom gained from outside experiences rendered the Vault Dwellers' reintegration impossible, a poignant reflection of the tension between knowledge and authority, experience and dogma, and individual agency versus institutional rigidity. And so, despite having accomplished what was perhaps humanity's most critical mission in the immediate post-war era, the Vault Dweller faced exile, a forced separation that not only removed him from his community, but symbolized the broader challenge of bridging the gap between the insulated vaults and the evolving societies of the wasteland. And in this exile, the narrative of his life became one of both triumph and loss, as he carried with him the lessons, relationships, and moral insights acquired through interactions with Junktown, Shady Sands, the Hub, the Brotherhood of Steel, and the complex human and mutant networks under the Master's control, experiences that simultaneously empowered him and isolated him, reinforcing the thematic tension between duty to one's people and the necessity of independent moral action. And this departure set the stage for his later ventures, including the founding of Arroyo, as it underscored the principle that survival, leadership, and ethical governance in a post-apocalyptic world are not guaranteed by institutional authority alone, but require courage, insight, and the willingness to act in the face of misunderstanding, rejection, and societal inertia. And thus, the Vault Dweller's exile became not a defeat, but a critical narrative pivot, illustrating that the restoration and evolution of human society in the wake of nuclear catastrophe are contingent upon individuals who are willing to bear the consequences of foresight, moral action, and the hard-earned knowledge of a world transformed by destruction, mutation, and the interplay of human ambition and folly, a lesson that would resonate through subsequent generations, shaping both the physical reconstruction of settlements and the ethical frameworks that would guide their development, demonstrating that the legacy of a single individual, forged in the crucible of apocalypse, can influence the trajectory of civilization far beyond immediate recognition, and that in exile, as in victory, the burdens of responsibility, experience, and moral judgment remain inseparable from the capacity to act, survive, and ultimately shape the fragile rebirth of a world scarred by humanity's own hand. In the aftermath of the Master's defeat and the Vault Dwellers' return to the wastes, the scattered remnants of human society began to show the first tangible signs of structured recovery, as settlements that had survived decades of isolation, mutation, and raider predation started to coalesce, trade networks re-emerged, and the fragile frameworks of governance took shape, most notably in places like Shady Sands, where under the guidance of leaders inspired by the Vault Dwellers' exploits and by the pressing necessity of survival, communities began to codify rules, enforce justice, and establish cooperative systems for resource distribution, defense, and conflict resolution, all of which reflected the broader principle that civilization, even in its infancy, depended upon collective action, shared norms, and the careful negotiation of human ambition and morality. And as Shady Sands expanded its influence, absorbing smaller, vulnerable settlements and establishing reliable trade routes to the hub and other communities, the seeds of larger political entities began to sprout, revealing that even in a post-nuclear landscape, social organization, diplomacy, and practical governance were as critical to survival as weapons, water, and shelter, and that the lessons imparted by figures like the Vault Dweller, the importance of ethical decision-making, strategic thinking, and moral courage, were not merely individual virtues but foundational principles for the reconstruction of society. And yet this period of growth was neither linear nor uncontested, for the wasteland remained a harsh and unpredictable environment in which resources were scarce, mutated creatures prowled, raider gangs threatened the security of fledgling communities, and ideological differences created friction, compelling leaders to navigate a delicate balance between defense, cooperation, and the enforcement of order. And in this context, the Vault Dweller's role extended beyond mere heroism to that of a catalyst, whose actions had demonstrated the necessity of decisive leadership, informed risk-taking, and the ethical integration of power into the service of collective survival, providing a blueprint for communities seeking to transcend the chaos of their environment. And as trade routes stabilized, settlements like Shady Sands became centers of governance, education, and resource management, attracting migrants, craftsmen, and scholars who contributed to the diversification and resilience of these early societies, while simultaneously fostering the creation of rudimentary political institutions, systems of law, and inter-settlement alliances that would serve as precursors to the broader structures of the new California Republic, illustrating that the physical and social reconstruction of the wasteland were inseparable processes, each dependent on the other, and that the practical lessons of survival, control of water, protection from mutation, and management of scarce resources were intrinsically linked to the development of governance, diplomacy, and moral frameworks capable of sustaining human life in a fragile and uncertain world. And within this broader narrative, the Vault Dweller's influence was evident not only in the redistribution of knowledge, the demonstration of moral courage, and the elimination of existential threats, but also in the inspiration provided to leaders, communities, and emerging social networks who witnessed the tangible benefits of coordinated action, ethical decision-making, and the careful application of power. For his journey underscored the principle that civilization could only emerge when individuals were willing to act decisively in the service of the collective, while also negotiating the moral ambiguities inherent in a post-apocalyptic environment. And through these processes, the early settlements laid down the foundational principles that would guide future political entities, including the codification of rules for dispute resolution, the establishment of trade agreements, and the creation of defense pacts against raiders and mutants, all of which reflected a growing awareness that survival and progress required cooperation, planning, and foresight, and that the mistakes of the pre-war world, hubris, technological abuse, and ideological extremism, must be avoided in favor of a more measured, ethical, and pragmatic approach, while also recognizing that human nature, ambition, and self-interest could never be entirely eliminated, and thus governance required continuous vigilance, flexibility, and the capacity to mediate between competing interests, a lesson that would inform both the Vault Dwellers' subsequent endeavors and the strategies employed by emerging leaders across Southern California. And as these seeds of civilization took root, they demonstrated the inherent resilience, creativity, and adaptability of human societies, showing that even in the aftermath of nuclear apocalypse, social cohesion, technological stewardship, and ethical leadership could combine to rebuild communities, protect survivors, and provide a foundation upon which future generations could expand, unify, and ultimately thrive. creating the early contours of what would become the new California Republic, an entity whose very existence was a testament to the lessons learned from catastrophe, heroism, and the painstaking cultivation of human cooperation, foresight, and moral judgment. And in this sense, the Vault Dweller's journey had far-reaching consequences, not merely in eliminating immediate threats, but in establishing the ethical, practical, and political frameworks necessary for human society to emerge from the ruins, demonstrating that the seeds of civilization, once sown with wisdom, courage, and foresight, could grow even in the harshest of soils, shaping the future of the wasteland for generations to come. Following his exile from Vault 13 and the essential conclusion of his mission to neutralize the Master, the Vault Dweller's story transitioned from the immediate struggle for survival to a legacy that would reverberate throughout the post-apocalyptic world. For while his deeds had saved countless lives, restored essential resources, and prevented the further spread of the Unity, he was now a figure both mythic and solitary, a wandering architect of civilization whose presence inspired hope and innovation, yet whose personal recognition within institutional structures was denied. And in this context, he founded the settlement of Arroyo, a new community designed to embody the lessons of the wasteland, integrating practical survival knowledge with the principles of cooperation, governance, and ethical decision-making that he had refined through years of navigation across a fractured California, creating a society that valued adaptability, collective responsibility, and the careful application of power, while avoiding the extremes of dogma or authoritarian control, exemplified by both the Master and even the Brotherhood of Steel. And in doing so, the Vault Dweller effectively became a living testament to the synthesis of experience, morality, and leadership, demonstrating that individual initiative, guided by ethical insight, could shape the course of society, influence generations, and provide a foundation for enduring human culture in a world still recovering from atomic devastation. And yet his personal narrative was marked by the paradox of heroism without recognition, of leadership accompanied by exile, and of profound influence tempered by isolation, a reflection of the broader post-apocalyptic condition in which acts of courage, moral clarity, and decisive action often occur outside conventional social acknowledgement, leaving survivors and future generations to interpret, mythologize, and integrate these lessons into the evolving social fabric. And in Arroyo, the Vault Dweller applied the knowledge accrued from his interactions with Shady Sands, Junktown, the Hub, the Brotherhood of Steel, and the Cathedral, teaching settlers the importance of technological stewardship, strategic resource management, defense against raiders and mutated threats, and the ethical exercise of authority, embedding these principles into the community's structures, rituals, and governance, which allowed Arroyo to flourish as both a sanctuary and a microcosm of the broader ideals of post-war civilization. And this settlement became a model for neighboring communities, demonstrating that ethical governance, combined with practical survival knowledge and a commitment to communal well-being, could produce stability, resilience, and the potential for expansion, even in a landscape marked by radiation, scarcity, and residual human conflict. And as time passed, the Vault Dweller's deeds, experiences, and decisions began to circulate in the oral histories, legends, and stories of the wasteland, transforming him into a figure of mythic proportions, an exemplar of the delicate balance between survival, morality, and the use of power. And through this mythologization, he influenced not only the immediate fate of Arroyo, but also the philosophical and ethical frameworks that would guide emerging settlements, alliances, and political entities, serving as both inspiration and cautionary tale for those navigating the morally complex, hazardous, and socially fluid post-nuclear environment. And in this duality, the Vault Dweller's fate encapsulated the central themes of human resilience and agency in the Fallout universe. He was both an ordinary individual thrust into extraordinary circumstances and a transformative force whose choices determined the survival and ethical trajectory of civilization, and though his personal recognition was limited, the impact of his actions ensured that the values he embodied, courage, prudence, moral reasoning, and strategic acumen, would echo throughout the generations, informing the development of new communities, shaping the early political landscape that would eventually crystallize into larger governing bodies, and establishing the principle that the survival and growth of human society depended on the careful combination of knowledge, ethical action, and foresight. And in reflecting upon his journey, from the initial crisis of the water chip to the confrontation with the Master, the infiltration of the cathedral, and the founding of Arroyo, it becomes evident that the Vault Dweller's legacy was less about personal accolades and more about the enduring influence of principled action on the reconstruction, moral guidance, and continuity of human civilization in the wasteland, illustrating that in a world forged from catastrophe, the deeds of one determined individual could reverberate far beyond their immediate context, providing a blueprint for survival, governance, and ethical engagement, and ensuring that even amid ruin, the potential for organized, morally grounded, and resilient human society could flourish, leaving a legacy, both practical and philosophical, that would define the trajectory of the wasteland long after the Vault Dweller himself had faded from direct memory. And this legacy, immortalized in the stories, structures, and emerging settlements inspired by his leadership, demonstrated that the first steps toward rebuilding civilization were not merely acts of survival, but deliberate, informed, and ethical interventions capable of shaping the moral and practical foundations of an entire society. In the years following the Vault Dweller's interventions, the post-apocalyptic landscape of Southern California began to take on a new and more structured form, as settlements stabilized, trade networks solidified, and factions that had survived the immediate aftermath of nuclear war consolidated their power. Among them, the Brotherhood of Steel, whose influence grew steadily as they continued their mission of technological stewardship, collecting, preserving, and securing pre-war artifacts, weapons, and knowledge, their presence acting as both a protective force and a controlling one, as they enforced their philosophy that humanity's survival depended upon the careful management of technology and the restriction of its misuse. Yet their expansion was tempered by the changing dynamics of the wasteland. For human settlements, like Shady Sands, Arroyo, and the Hub were no longer merely vulnerable enclaves, but increasingly organized communities capable of self-governance, trade, and collective defense, and these developments created a delicate balance between the militarized, ideologically rigid Brotherhood and the more fluid, morally pragmatic human settlements, demonstrating the evolving complexity of power in the post-war world, where authority, survival, and ethical considerations intersected with practical necessity. And in this environment, the role of the Vault Dweller's legacy was evident, for the communities he had influenced served as exemplars of governance, cooperation, and technological prudence, showing that human society could advance without succumbing to authoritarian control or ideological extremism, and simultaneously, the threat posed by mutants, though diminished after the Master's fall, persisted in smaller, localized forms, reminding the burgeoning societies that vigilance, adaptation, and strategic defense remained essential. And as these settlements expanded, they established political structures, alliances, and economic systems that transformed the wasteland from a chaotic collection of isolated communities into a network of interdependent entities capable of sustaining population growth, trade, and cultural continuity. And in parallel, the Brotherhood of Steel's expanding presence reinforced the centrality of technology as both a tool and a source of power, guiding their actions while creating tension with local leaders who sought autonomy and practical access to pre-war devices, highlighting the ongoing negotiation between preservation and empowerment, control and collaboration that defined the emerging new order. And as towns codified laws, organized militias, and invested in communal infrastructure, the balance of power shifted further toward a system in which human agency, resilience, and foresight determined success. Yet the legacy of the Brotherhood's isolationist and authoritarian tendencies served as a reminder that centralized control, even in service of the greater good, could stifle innovation, limit resource distribution, and create conflict. And thus the post-Fallout 1 era became a period of experimentation in governance, ethics, and societal structure, in which human settlements sought to learn from past mistakes, incorporate lessons from the Vault Dwellers' actions, and establish durable institutions capable of withstanding both environmental threats and the unpredictable tendencies of human behavior. And through these processes, the new order of steel and stone emerged as a hybrid system, the Brotherhood as the guardian of technological knowledge, settlements like Shady Sands and Arroyo as exemplars of practical governance and moral adaptability, and the wasteland itself as a proving ground for the iterative development of resilient, ethical, and strategically minded communities, all of which reflected the broader philosophical narrative of the Fallout universe, in which survival is inseparable from morality, knowledge is inseparable from responsibility, and the rebuilding of society is an ongoing negotiation between past hubris and future possibility. And in this context, the consolidation of power, resources, and knowledge after the events of Fallout 1 was not merely a pragmatic development, but a critical stage in the shaping of the political, social, and technological trajectories of the post-apocalyptic world, laying the groundwork for the eventual formation of larger, more centralized states, such as the new California Republic, whose ethical frameworks, governance models, and military structures drew upon the lessons of both success and failure that had defined the Vault Dwellers era. And as the Brotherhood expanded their holdings, collected pre-war technology, and monitored human settlements, they established a form of indirect influence that reinforced order, while avoiding direct governance, allowing human societies to experiment, innovate, and rebuild according to their own needs and ethical judgments. And simultaneously, the diminished mutant presence, the stabilization of communities, and the establishment of reliable trade routes created an environment in which collaboration, strategic foresight, and ethical leadership became paramount, demonstrating that the interplay of technology, human agency, and moral decision-making was the defining characteristic of this new order. And in observing these developments, it became clear that Fallout 1 had not merely concluded with the defeat of a singular antagonist, but had catalyzed the emergence of a nuanced, multi-layered societal ecosystem, where power was distributed, knowledge was curated, and survival was inseparable from ethical action, with the Vault Dwellers' influence continuing to resonate as both a practical guide and a moral touchstone, ensuring that the rebuilding of the wasteland was informed by experience, wisdom, and the recognition that the balance between control and freedom, preservation and innovation, authority and agency, would define the long-term trajectory of human civilization in the irradiated world. And in this ongoing reconstruction, the new order of steel and stone represented not a static triumph, but a dynamic, evolving framework in which humanity's capacity to govern itself, preserve knowledge, and adapt to environmental and societal challenges could determine whether civilization would endure, prosper, and ultimately transcend the mistakes of the pre-war world, reflecting the enduring truth that survival, ethics, and strategic foresight are inseparable pillars of human continuity in the Fallout universe, a lesson forged in the wasteland, embodied by the Vault Dweller, and carried forward by every settlement, faction, and individual who chose to act with both prudence and moral clarity in a world rebuilt from atomic fire. As the dust settled over Southern California in the wake of the Vault Dwellers' journey, the fall of the Master, and the establishment of fledgling settlements and governing systems, the enduring truth of the wasteland became evident. Despite the passage of time, the evolution of societies, and the rise of new orders, war, conflict, and human ambition remained constants, a reflection of the persistent tensions, desires, and flaws that had brought humanity to the brink in 2077 and continued to shape the post-nuclear world. And while the immediate threat of the Master and the Unity had been removed, the factors that enabled their rise, scarcity of resources, competing ideologies, technological potential, and the innate drive for survival and dominance, remained, ensuring that the shadows of conflict would linger even in times of apparent peace. And this reality underscored the cyclical nature of human history, where civilizations, no matter how noble or well-intentioned, are perpetually confronted with the need to balance ambition, ethical judgment, and practical survival. For in the wasteland, every decision carried consequences that could ignite skirmishes, destabilize communities, or alter the trajectory of emerging societies. And the Vault Dwellers' experiences demonstrated that the fight for survival was never solely physical, but also moral, ideological, and strategic, requiring individuals and communities to navigate a complex web of choices, alliances, and conflicts, while safeguarding both life and the principles upon which civilization might be rebuilt. And as settlements like Shady Sands, Arroyo, and the Hub consolidated power, established governance, and developed trade networks, they also contended with persistent threats from raiders, rogue mutants, environmental hazards, and the potential misuse of technology, highlighting that the process of rebuilding society was inseparable from the vigilance required to prevent its destruction. And in observing these dynamics, the narrative of the wasteland revealed the interplay of human resilience and human fallibility, where acts of heroism, moral courage, and strategic foresight could stabilize communities, while hubris, greed, and short-sightedness could just as easily precipitate collapse. And this duality, present since the first detonations of 2077, continued to shape the moral and political landscape, ensuring that even as new orders of steel, stone, and governance emerged, the lessons of the past remained relevant, a cautionary reminder that survival alone was insufficient without the disciplined application of wisdom, ethical judgment, and social cooperation. And as the Vault Dweller's legacy spread through the stories, actions, and communities he influenced, it became clear that the human capacity for reconstruction, adaptation, and moral growth was tempered by the persistent reality of conflict. For every new alliance, technological acquisition, or territorial expansion carried the potential for both progress and strife, creating a delicate balance between the promise of civilization and the ever-present possibility of war. And in this context, the wasteland functioned as both a laboratory and a crucible, testing the endurance, ethics, and ingenuity of those who inhabited it, with every settlement, caravan, and interaction serving as a microcosm of the broader struggle for order, stability, and moral integrity. And as the Vault Dweller observed, participated in, and influenced these developments, he became a living embodiment of the principle that while survival requires courage and skill, the preservation and growth of society demand foresight, cooperation, and the continual exercise of moral and strategic judgment, a principle that would resonate far beyond his own lifetime and inform the emergence of larger political entities, such as the new California Republic, the expansion of the Brotherhood of Steel, and the ongoing resistance to the scattered remnants of mutant forces, raider gangs, and ideological extremists. And yet, despite these advancements, the underlying truth remained unchanged. War, in its various forms, be it ideological, territorial, technological, or personal, was an enduring condition, a force that shaped human behavior, compelled difficult ethical choices, and defined the trajectory of civilization from the atomic age through the post-apocalyptic era. And this constancy framed the philosophical and historical understanding of the wasteland, illustrating that while individuals like the Vault Dweller could influence the course of events, mitigate threats, and inspire social cohesion, they could not alter the fundamental patterns of human ambition, conflict, and resilience. For these patterns were deeply embedded in the nature of survival itself, and in reflecting upon the chain of events from the Great War of 2077, the rise and fall of the Master, and the emergence of new orders and settlements, it became evident that the wasteland's history was not merely a chronicle of destruction and recovery, but a continuous testament to the interplay of human ingenuity, folly, courage, and conflict, a narrative that would repeat in cycles of creation, conquest, and renewal across generations, shaping the moral, political, and technological frameworks of future societies, and reinforcing the enduring lesson that while weapons, settlements, and technology may change, the underlying dynamics of human ambition, ethical struggle, and the necessity of vigilance in the face of existential threats remain constant. A truth captured in the repeated observation that war never changes, and that every human endeavor, no matter how well-intentioned, occurs within the shadow of conflict, scarcity, and the perpetual negotiation between survival, morality, and power, a lesson as relevant to the Vault Dweller and the fledgling communities of the late 22nd century, as it would be for all generations of humanity navigating the delicate balance between creation and destruction in a world forever altered by the fire of its own making.